Welcome, nocturnal minds, back to our class. Oh, you are really study hard. So, picking up from our discussion on the general principles of scientific unity and evaluation standards, let's now focus on a specific domain where these ideas have been profoundly tested: biology. For a long time, philosophy of science was largely fixated on physics, Newton, Einstein, the big shiny objects. But since the mid-20th century, biologists and philosophers alike started realizing that life sciences were doing some seriously deep thinking too. Initially, it was kind of like using biology as a lab rat for philosophical theories about science itself. But then, bam, the evolutionary and molecular revolutions hit, and suddenly, there were all these fascinating, unique questions bubbling up from biology that grabbed both camps. This wasn't just about checking if old theories held water. It was about understanding how biology itself was shaping our understanding of science, and indeed, of everything. Now, when we talk about biology getting its own philosophical voice, Darwin is the undisputed heavyweight champion. Forget Kant's famous quip about needing a Newton for the blade of grass. Darwin basically handed him one, or at least showed him how nature could do the job without divine intervention. Darwin himself knew his work was shaking things up philosophically. He famously said understanding baboons would get you further in metaphysics than reading Locke. And he wasn't wrong. His ideas on sexual selection, group dynamics, even morality and psychology, these weren't just side notes, they became massive fields later. Thinkers across the board, from those tackling the meaning of information in biology, talismanics to those wrestling with ethics or how we know things, found Darwin's framework incredibly useful. What he did was revolutionary. He gave us a purely causal story for why things look designed. Before Darwin, explaining purpose in nature often meant invoking teleology, some inherent goal-directedness, whether from Aristotle or God. Darwin flipped the script, showing how adaptation could arise purely through chance variation and environmental filtering. Did he banish purpose entirely? Or did he just show it was an emergent property of a causal process? Darwin himself dodged the bullet, but the question remains a classic puzzle. Okay, so Darwin gave us natural selection. Sounds great, right? A powerful explanation. But almost immediately, philosophers hit a snag. What exactly is this thing called fitness? It's the core concept, but defining it properly is tricky business. Imagine the basic principle of natural selection. If organism X is fitter than organism Y, then X will likely leave more offspring. Simple enough. But what does fitter mean here? If we just define fitness as having more offspring, then the statement becomes tautological. It's like saying, if Bob is taller than Bill, then Bob is taller than Bill. No real explanatory power there. So, philosophers tried to finesse it. One popular idea was to define fitness probabilistically, not just about actual reproduction, but the propensity or tendency to reproduce. That sounds better, right? It breaks the tautology. But then new problems pop up. Does fitness depend only on the next generation, or the long run? What about variance? Maybe organism A has a slightly higher chance of having many kids this year, but organism B is much more likely to have lots of grandkids overall. Which one is truly fitter? Defining fitness becomes a minefield of short-term versus long-term perspectives, and whether variability matters. It's a surprisingly thorny issue that really got people thinking about the foundations of evolutionary theory. Moving into the early century, the debate didn't die down, it evolved. Philosophers started digging deeper into the statistical heart of natural selection, especially how it interacts with another major force in evolution, genetic drift. Drift is basically random change, the luck of the draw in genetics, especially in small populations or when disasters strike. Think floods wiping out most of a population by chance. So, the big question became, how do these two forces, selection and drift, play together? Are they like two drivers steering the evolutionary car, each contributing their own vector? Or is selection itself inherently probabilistic, making it hard to separate from drift? Some argued that maybe selection doesn't explain things in the traditional causal way, but rather through statistical patterns that just happen. Others went further, suggesting there might be a fundamental tendency for life to diversify, like Newton's first law of motion, operating even without selection. Despite all this progress, understanding the precise relationship between these stochastic processes and how they contribute to evolutionary outcomes is still a major area of active research and debate. It's not just academic navel-gazing. It fundamentally affects how we interpret evolutionary history and predict future trajectories. Here's another headache for philosophers: laws in biology. We love laws in physics: F equals ma, E equals mc squared. Beautiful, universal, exceptionless generalizations. But does biology have anything like that? The theory of natural selection seemed pretty vague compared to Newtonian mechanics. So philosophers started hunting for biological laws elsewhere. They looked at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, Fisher's predictions about sex ratios, ecological rules like competitive exclusion. Seemed promising, right? But then came the objections. Hardy-Weinberg, that's just math. Competitive exclusion. Turns out it's just a consequence of natural selection itself, so if selection isn't a law, neither is exclusion. The central dogma of molecular biology: DNA makes RNA, makes protein. Oops, exceptions like retroviruses showed up. Even phylogenetic claims, like robins have blue eggs, relied on specific conditions and could be overturned by evolution. It was like trying to find solid ground and finding quicksand everywhere. This frustrating search actually pushed philosophers to rethink what a law even is, suggesting that maybe biology needs a different kind of explanatory framework than physics provides. It forced a re-evaluation of the very concept of scientific law. John Beatty offered a rather bleak perspective on this lack of laws. His argument essentially says, forget finding universal laws in biology beyond the process of natural selection itself. Why? Because everything else in biology, all the regularities we observe, are temporary. They arise because natural selection worked its magic under specific historical and environmental conditions. But those conditions can change. New mutations, environmental shifts, arms races between species, anything can disrupt the finely tuned adaptations. So, according to Beatty, there won't be any lasting exceptionless laws governing biological phenomena beyond the dynamics of evolution itself. Now, add to this the fact that biologists constantly talk about function. We say the heart's function is to pump blood, the gene's function is to code for protein. William Harvey explained the heart beats to circulate blood centuries ago. But wait a minute, doesn't that explain the cause, the beat, by its effect, circulation? That felt backwards after the scientific revolution ditched final causes. Trying to fit functional explanations into the standard model of science, deductive nomology, also failed. The generalizations aren't laws, and hearts don't strictly cause beating. So, biology seems stuck with this functional language which feels distinct from the mechanistic explanations dominant elsewhere in science. So, how do we reconcile this functional talk with a causal scientific worldview? Larry Wright proposed a clever solution. Whenever we talk about function implicitly, we can always translate it back into a story about historical selection pressures. The heart pumps blood because natural selection favored ancestors whose hearts did that. This neat trick pushes the burden back onto proving that the components of natural selection, variation, heredity, differential reproduction, themselves have some kind of lawful status. But not everyone bought it. Some argue that function isn't always about past selection. Robert Cummins offered an alternative: define function purely by causal role. What does this part do for the whole system? On this view, even rocks in a river could have a function for the river if they help create turbulence. The beauty here is that it frees biologists from assuming everything is an evolutionary adaptation. A structure could be a constraint, a byproduct, or just plain luck and still have a function. This naturally led to pushback against the rising tide of adaptationism, especially in sociobiology. Gold and Lewontin's famous spandrels paper basically said, hold on. Not everything is an adaptation. Things like spandrels in architecture are structural necessities, not optimal designs. Evolution has constraints, and sometimes traits just emerge as byproducts. This sparked huge debates about the scope and limits of adaptationist explanations. The adaptationism debate hit another snag with the concept of homology. Homologous structures are ones that share a common ancestor, even if they don't look alike or do the same job now. Think whale flippers, bat wings, and human arms. If we strictly follow the selected effects view of function, how can we identify these homologous traits if they've lost their original function? If function is key to identification, but homologous traits differ in function, we seem stuck. This highlights a deep connection between taxonomy, development, and evolutionary theory. Then there's the grand reductionist dream. Can all of biology ultimately be reduced to physics via molecular biology? Early hopes were high, thinking Mendelian genetics could be neatly derived from molecular biology, once we understood genes as DNA sequences. But obstacles piled up. First, the whole debate about whether there are any distinctively biological laws. If there aren't, what are we reducing? Second, even molecular biology is full of functional talk, like DNA needing thymine for fidelity. How do you reduce that to non-functional chemistry? And most damningly, multiple realizability. The same function, like flight, can be achieved by vastly different physical structures. Natural selection often picks whichever works, regardless of the underlying mechanism. This makes it incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible, to draw a clean line between the structure and function levels needed for a straightforward reduction. It suggests biology might have a certain autonomy. Let's talk about who gets selected. For a long time, the consensus was pretty clear: natural selection acts on genes. But then came the controversial idea of group selection. Could traits evolve because they benefit the group even if they hurt the individual? Think altruism, or maybe even cooperation. Biologists like Williams and Hamilton initially threw cold water on it, arguing it was unlikely or unnecessary. Philosophers like Sober and Wimsatt jumped in, analyzing the concepts carefully. Is selection happening at multiple levels simultaneously? Can we even distinguish the unit of selection? After intense debate, fueled by mathematical tools developed by Price and Hamilton, the tide turned. By the late 20th century, group selection was seen not as a fringe idea, but a legitimate possibility, crucial for understanding social behaviors. This opened the floodgates for applying evolutionary thinking to human societies and culture. It also revived interest in other big questions. How did sexual reproduction emerge? How do we explain major transitions in life's history, like cells forming multicellular organisms or individuals forming societies? These are moments where the old units of selection get packaged together and individual interests get subordinated to the collective. Explaining these transitions requires grappling with the multi-level nature of selection. All these biological debates inevitably spill over into the human sciences. The rise of sociobiology and evolutionary psychology, spearheaded by figures like E.O. Wilson, ignited fierce controversy. Could evolutionary principles explain human behavior, culture, even morality? Philosophers weighing in used all the tools developed in the philosophy of biology. On one hand, critics argued against simplistic genetic determinism. They pointed out flaws in the very idea of a gene for something complex, like intelligence or social behavior. Others challenged the notion that cultural evolution operates like biological evolution, questioning the existence of cultural replicators like Dawkins' memes. Do ideas replicate faithfully enough? Do they persist long enough? Defenders of cultural evolution pushed back, arguing that the exact analogy isn't necessary. The debates around group selection, nature-nurture, and the innateness of Lang think Chomsky's arguments inspiring evolutionary approaches all converge here. It became clear that the fundamental questions in the philosophy of biology and psychology were deeply intertwined, sometimes almost identical. Understanding one required grappling with the other. And finally, biology touches on ethics. Again, the link isn't new. Spencer's disastrous misappropriation of Darwin as social Darwinism comes to mind. But more recently, philosophers have explored a different path, using evolutionary insights to understand the origins of our moral systems. The idea is that cooperative norms, feelings of guilt or shame, perhaps even concepts of fairness, might have evolved because they conferred fitness benefits to groups engaging in repeated interactions. Game theorists showed mathematically how cooperation can be stable in repeated prisoners' dilemmas. Moral philosophers like Gibbard discussed how emotions help enforce these norms. Social scientists found evidence for universal emotional responses tied to fairness. Add punishment mechanisms, and you get a compelling group selection story for the evolution of human morality. This naturalistic approach, heavily influenced by philosophers, tempted some scientists and popularizers to go further, attempting to derive normative conclusions directly from evolutionary history. This, of course, reopened the old can of worms. The classic Humean problem of deriving ought from is what's often called the naturalistic fallacy. Can we really justify what we ought to do based solely on what is, even if that what is has evolutionary roots? So, wrapping up biology, it's clear that Darwin's legacy is immense. The implications of the Darwinian framework reach far beyond the laboratory bench, touching on almost every aspect of how we understand ourselves and the world. As we'll see next, this deep dive into the philosophy of biology reveals just how interconnected these scientific domains are, offering rich insights not just for philosophy of science, but for philosophy as a whole. All right, shifting gears from the complexities of life to the transformations of matter. Let's explore chemistry. At its core, chemistry is about understanding how substances change and interact. To do this, we rely on fundamental concepts, elements, the basic building blocks, substances, the materials made from them, and structure, how atoms are arranged and bonded. For a long time, chemists debated whether elements were truly distinct kinds of atoms. Once atomic theory gained traction, chemists started drawing detailed structural formulas, though there was skepticism about whether these represented reality or just convenient models. The real breakthrough came with the marriage of chemistry and physics in the 20th century. Quantum mechanics, spectroscopy, X-ray crystallography allowed us to probe molecular structures with unprecedented detail. Yet, despite this progress, the fundamental categories of element, substance, and structure remain absolutely central to how chemists explain the world. This brings us to a fascinating intersection with philosophy of language and mind, sparked by Kripke and Putnam's work in the Chiches. They proposed a causal theory of reference for natural kind terms like water and gold. Their key insight, relevant to chemistry, was that these terms refer to things based on their underlying microstructure. Gold refers to the stuff with atomic number 79, period. Water refers to HRO, period. Crucially, this view involves semantic externalism. The meaning or reference of a word isn't just in our heads, it's tied to the actual properties of the world, properties we might not even know about. Before we knew about atoms, the word gold already referred to the element with atomic number 79. Discovering the atomic number was an empirical discovery, not a definition. This raises profound questions. Is this microstructural link the definitive way to understand chemical kinds? Let's dig into that. Chemistry deals with a whole spectrum of kinds. We have elements, compounds, mixtures, and also broader categories like metals or acids. Chemists use formulae like HRO, but these can be ambiguous. Does HRO refer to a single molecule, an oxygen atom bonded to two hydrogens, or does it refer to the bulk substance composed of hydrogen and oxygen in a R/E ratio? It's both depending on context. And it gets fuzzier. Not every microscopic species corresponds to a distinct substance. Think about ions like H3O or NH4. They're important parts of substances but aren't standalone substances themselves. Some species like diatomic helium He are too fleeting to characterize a stable substance, although transient species like carbonium ions are crucial for understanding reaction mechanisms. Conversely, not every substance is made of a single type of molecule. Common salt, NaCl, is a crystal lattice of sodium and chloride ions. So, the relationship between the microscopic and macroscopic isn't always a simple one-to-one mapping. Let's zoom in on elements. Chemists use the term element in at least two ways. Sometimes they mean the free element, like metallic sodium or chlorine gas, the uncombined state. But more generally, element refers to the basic substance, the fundamental kind, regardless of its chemical state. So, chlorine in common salt is still chlorine understood as the element. This general sense is what populates the periodic table. Mendeleev, when creating his groundbreaking table, relied heavily on the properties of compounds, not just the free elements. Why? Because free elements often change their properties drastically when combined. In 1923, IUPAC formally defined elements by their nuclear charge, the atomic number. This was a huge step, acknowledging that isotopes atoms of the same element with different numbers of neutrons, hence, different masses are still the same element. This definition focuses on what survives chemical change, the nucleus. So, we arrive at microstructuralism, the idea that the identity of a chemical substance is determined by its underlying microstructure. For elements, that means nuclear charge. For compounds, it's typically chemical structure. This isn't just a descriptive claim. It often implies a metaphysical one. Substances have essences defined by their microstructure. But critics like Needham and Van Brakel argue this view, especially as presented by Kripke and Putnam, is too simplistic and lacks strong motivation. Even if you accept the causal theory of reference, why must microstructure be the determining factor? Thermodynamics gives us a macroscopic criterion: mixing two different substances always increases entropy. Couldn't we define gold as the stuff that doesn't increase entropy when mixed with itself? The case for microstructuralism needs to be built on the actual practices and explanatory goals of chemistry itself. Take elements again. Krypton, for instance, has many necessary properties: its electron configuration, its spectral lines, its chemical inertness. Why is having atomic number 36 the special property that defines krypton? Van Brakel points out that any number of properties could be cited. The answer lies in chemistry's own interests. Element names apply to things regardless of their chemical state. Whatever defines an element must be something that persists through chemical reactions, gaining or losing electrons. That means it has to be a nuclear property. The obvious candidates are nuclear charge, atomic number, and nuclear mass. Isotopes show that mass varies within an element, carbon 12 vs carbon 14, but they generally behave chemically almost identically, though with subtle rate differences. The heavy water toxicity is a dramatic exception, but it's largely due to hydrogen's light mass. For heavier elements, isotope effects are minimal. Quantum mechanics tells us why nuclear charge dictates the electron cloud, which dictates chemistry. So, chemists choosing nuclear charge as the defining feature makes perfect sense given their goal of understanding chemical behavior. Now, what about compounds? If elemental composition defined them, life would be easy. But then we hit isomerism. Ethanol CH3CHROH and dimethyl-ether CH3OCH3 have the exact same elements in the exact same proportions, but they are chemically and physically distinct. Ethanol boils near room temperature, ether boils way below freezing. Clearly, the difference lies in their molecular structures, but appealing to structure introduces new problems. First, structure itself is vague. It's defined by continuous variables, like bond lengths and angles. How do you draw a sharp line between two slightly different structures? This vagueness bleeds into the definition of substances. Second, how is this classical notion of molecular structure actually realized in the quantum world? That's a deep puzzle we'll touch on later. Third, even seemingly simple substances can be complex internally. Water, the poster child for HRO, is far from a uniform collection of identical molecules. The slogan, "Water is HRO," sounds simple, but Needham argues it hides complexity. Real water isn't just a bunch of independent HRO molecules floating around. First, some HRO molecules spontaneously dissociate into hydronium, H-SUNO-MI, and hydroxide OH-means. Second, even undissociated HRO molecules are polar, meaning they attract each other strongly via hydrogen bonds. This leads to the formation of temporary oligomers, small clusters of water molecules linked together, somewhat like tiny bits of ice. So, macroscopic water is a dynamic mixture of HRO, ions, and oligomers, constantly forming and breaking apart. Can we just call the ions and oligomers impurities? Hardly. They affect water's viscosity and boiling point, and they are essential for its conductivity. Treating water as merely a collection of HRO molecules seems to ignore a lot of what chemists actually study and measure. So, if water isn't just HRO molecules, what is it? Needham and Van Brakel suggest we should think of a body of water as a macroscopic object with a complex microstructure, but the identity of water comes from its macroscopic properties and behavior, perhaps related to thermodynamic criteria, like entropy of mixing. However, they acknowledge that criterion might be too fine-grained. Alternatively, chemistry could be seen as studying the dispositional properties of stuffs, manipulating macroscopic samples. But then, individual H2O molecules wouldn't count as water, as they don't have macroscopic properties. Another way to salvage microstructuralism is to accept the molecular complexity but redefine composition. Maybe being water means being composed of HRO molecules, including the transient interactions where ions form and reform. In this view, the smallest thing that is water is an individual H2O molecule. Ions and protons are only water as part of a larger body. This tries to keep the microstructural core while acknowledging the messy reality. While the case for microstructuralism seems strongest for elements, it's less clear-cut for compounds. Water is a tricky case, but many other molecular substances are more uniform. And then there are non-molecular substances altogether, like ionic crystals or polymers, which need different kinds of microstructural descriptions. The discussion also tends to focus narrowly on chemists' classificatory interests. Names in other fields, or even everyday language, might pick out substances differently. Wood, wool, silk, we might identify them by origin or use, not microstructure, even if artificial silk has the same microstructure as natural silk. This doesn't necessarily kill microstructuralism for chemistry, though. Different disciplines or contexts can have different criteria for identity. Consider jade. Jewelers might lump jadeite and nephrite together as jade, but chemists know they are distinct substances with different microstructures. Usage varies, but the underlying scientific principles can still hold. Now, let's tackle the big question: chemistry and physics. Can chemistry be reduced to physics? For decades, this was seen as the poster child for successful reduction. Nagel, Oppenheim, and Putnam envisioned a neat hierarchy where chemistry sits just above atomic physics, unified through micro-reduction. There are two layers here. First, relating macroscopic substances to their constituent microscopic species like molecules. Second, relating those microscopic species to their physical basis, electrons and nuclei. We can approach this reduction in two ways: intertheoretically, asking if we can derive chemical laws from physical laws, or ontologically, asking if the entities and properties of chemistry are nothing but those of physics. The hope for intertheoretic reduction rests heavily on quantum chemistry. The dream is to take the Schrödinger equation for a system of electrons and nuclei interacting via electrostatic forces and solve it to predict all chemical properties. For the simplest case, the hydrogen atom, we can do this exactly. But for anything more complex, like helium or a molecule, exact solutions are impossible. Instead, chemists use a whole toolbox of approximations and computational models. The problem is, these models often rely on assumptions and calibrations drawn directly from chemistry itself, like the order of filling electron orbitals or the shapes of molecules. Critics argue this means quantum chemistry isn't really deriving chemical properties from fundamental physics. It's using chemistry to inform its application of physics. The models are useful proxies, but they don't strictly meet the classical demands of reduction. Reductionists might respond, okay, the models are approximate, but that's common in physics. They need to be justifiable approximations to exact solutions. The Born-Oppenheimer approximation is often cited as justification. It assumes nuclei are so massive they move slowly, so we can treat them as fixed while calculating the electron's quantum behavior. Seems reasonable, right? But Woolley raises serious objections. First, consider isomerism. Ethanol and dimethyl ether have the same nuclei and electrons, so in principle, the same Schrödinger equation. How can the same equation possibly yield different molecular structures? Second, and more fundamentally, symmetry. Exact solutions to the Schrödinger equation for an isolated molecule should be spherically symmetric. But the Born-Oppenheimer model imposes a lower symmetry corresponding to the molecule's shape. This isn't just a minor detail. It affects crucial explanations, like chirality, why molecules rotate plane polarized light. Exact QM predicts zero rotation for a symmetric system. So, the proxy defense seems to fail. The Born-Oppenheimer approximation introduces features not justified by the exact theory. Even the original champions of reduction like Nagel and Oppenheim knew deriving everything deductively was unlikely. Reduction might succeed eventually, or chemistry might ditch the non-reducible concepts. But could chemistry be permanently irreducible? Two main reasons are suggested. First, maybe chemistry has unique conceptual tools or explanatory practices that just don't fit physics, and we can't eliminate them. Thinkers like Primus suggest chemistry reads structure into a fundamentally quantum world, or pluralists like Van Brakel argue physics and chemistry are just different levels of discourse. Second, even if we could theoretically derive all chemical properties from physics, does that mean chemistry's subject matter is nothing but physics's? Composition doesn't guarantee reduction. Supervenience just means properties change together. It doesn't rule out emergence. Robin Lepoidvin tried to argue for ontological reducibility by saying chemical properties are exhausted by combinations of physical properties. But objections arise. Lepoidvin's argument only covers discrete properties like elements. Chemistry also deals with continuous properties like molecular structure. And even if chemical properties are combinations of physical ones, why does that make them reducible? Think about Kim's causal powers criterion. A is reducible to B only if A's causal powers are fully explained by B's. Just because chemical properties supervene on physical ones doesn't mean they don't add new causal powers. If there are sui generis laws linking molecular structures to their causal effects, not derivable from fundamental physics, then chemistry is irreducibly emergent. Does such a gap exist? The symmetry problem discussed earlier suggests it might. Molecular structure explains countless chemical phenomena, yet its ultimate grounding in exact QM is murky. Whether quantum chemistry provides a full reduction or reveals emergence depends on how we interpret the relationship between these levels of explanation. So, wrapping up chemistry, it's a fascinating case study. Its detailed engagement with fundamental physics offers unique insights, perhaps even testing grounds for philosophical arguments about causality and the mental realm. Yet, despite the power of quantum mechanics, concepts like molecular structure and the chemical bond retain their explanatory power in chemistry. The quest to fully understand the relationship between chemistry and physics continues, highlighting the richness and complexity of the chemical world.